Sherlock Holmes and the Case of the Blackthorn Legacy, being an account of the singular events at Blackthorn Manor, as set down by Dr. John H. Watson, M.D. Chapter 1. The Dying Candle of Blackthorn. It was on a raw and blustering Thursday in late November that the affairs of Blackthorn Manor first intruded upon the ordered calm of our Baker Street lodgings. A north wind had been harassing London since before dawn, rattling the sash windows of 221B and driving cold fingers of draught beneath every ill-fitted door in the city. I had spent the morning reading dispatches from Afghanistan, a habit I had never quite surrendered despite the years elapsed since my own service there, while Holmes sat coiled in his armchair like a great, brooding spider, fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes fixed upon some invisible point above the mantelpiece. He had not spoken in 3 hours, which I had come to recognize as either profound contemplation or the early stirrings of dangerous boredom. The fire in the grate had burned low, casting long, uncertain shadows across the cluttered sitting room, its shelves groaning with chemical apparatus, its walls adorned with Holmes's various experiments in indexing criminal arcana. A half-finished monograph on tobacco ash lay discarded near his feet. The Persian slipper that served as his tobacco pouch had been overturned, its contents scattered carelessly across the hearthrug. All of this told me, with the quiet fluency of long acquaintance, that Holmes was restless. London, in his estimation, had been singularly dull for a fortnight. It was therefore with a sensation compounded equally of relief and apprehension that I heard Mrs. Hudson's familiar tread upon the stair, followed by a brisk knock. "A lady to see you, Mr. Holmes," she announced, opening the door to admit a figure so composed in bearing and so evidently distressed beneath that composure that she arrested my attention at once. She was perhaps 40 years of age, dressed in deep mourning of good quality, black crape at collar and cuff, a small jet brooch at her throat, a veil drawn up from a face that was pale and angular, with grey eyes of considerable intelligence. She carried herself with the dignity of a woman accustomed to authority, yet her hands, tightly gloved in black kid, betrayed a fine trembling she could not entirely suppress. "Mr. Holmes," she said, "I am Miss Cordelia Ashwood, companion and secretary to the late Sir Reginald Blackthorn of Blackthorn Manor in Herefordshire. I have come to you because I believe a grave injustice is being done, and because Inspector Marvell of the local constabulary, for all his self-satisfaction, has not the wit to see what lies directly before his nose." Holmes uncoiled from his chair with surprising swiftness, gesturing toward the basket chair opposite his own. "Pray be seated, Miss Ashwood. Watson, close the window. This wind is insufferable. Now then." He fixed the lady with that penetrating grey gaze that so many found unnerving. "You have travelled since early morning. The Paddington line, I should think, arriving at approximately 10:30. You took a cab directly here without stopping for refreshment, which suggests urgency. You are not yourself a woman of great wealth, yet the morning dress is of excellent quality and recently acquired, which implies that Sir Reginald's household maintained its domestic staff in good comfort. You have not slept properly in several nights, and you are, despite your admirable self-control, very frightened indeed." Miss Ashwood stared at him. "How do you— The mud on your boots is consistent with the morning trains from the west. The dried salt at the corner of your right eye speaks of tears wept some hours ago and not repeated since, a determined woman marshalling herself. The hems of your dress are precisely 3 days old in their creases, consistent with a garment ordered in haste at a provincial mourning warehouse. But we waste time. Sir Reginald Blackthorn is dead. The question is how. He was found dead in his study at Blackthorn Manor 3 days ago," said Miss Ashwood, her voice steadying as she found the relief of speaking her fears aloud. "The door was locked from the inside. The windows were fastened. He had been alone since 9:30 in the evening, having dismissed his manservant Crow. The household retired at 11. At 7 the following morning, when Sir Reginald did not appear for breakfast, an unprecedented circumstance, for he was a man of rigid habit, Crowe was sent to rouse him, found the door locked, and ultimately broke it down. Sir Reginald was found slumped in his desk chair, cold and dead, with an expression of what the doctor described as acute horror upon his face. "The cause of death?" Holmes asked. "That is precisely the difficulty. Dr. Finch, our local physician, could find no immediately obvious cause. There was no wound, no sign of violence, no evidence of any intruder. Inspector Marvell has satisfied himself that Sir Reginald died of a heart seizure brought on by the shock of some powerful emotion. He has declared the matter closed and is preparing to release the inquest findings accordingly." Holmes's eyes had grown very bright. "And yet you are not satisfied?" "No, Mr. Holmes, I am not. Sir Reginald was 62 years of age, it is true, but he was examined by Dr. Finch not a fortnight before his death, and pronounced in excellent health for his years. More than that," she reached into her reticule and withdrew a small envelope. "I found this beneath the blotter on Sir Reginald's desk." The inspector dismissed it as of no consequence. Holmes took the envelope without opening it, turning it over in his long fingers, examining it with that close, abstracted attention he gave to all physical evidence. "You touched this before bringing it to me?" "I wore gloves. I had the presence of mind for that much." "Good." He extracted the single sheet within and spread it flat upon the arm of his chair. I leaned forward to read it. It was a short note, written in a thin, scratching hand on plain paper without a heading. "The debt falls due at midnight on the 30th. What was buried at Blackthorn does not remain buried. Come prepared to pay, or I shall ensure that all the world knows what you did in the winter of 1871. A silence fell over the room, broken only by the moan of the wind. "The 30th, I said. "That is the night Sir Reginald died." "Precisely so," said Miss Ashwood. Holmes folded the note with great care and tucked it into his breast pocket. "Miss Ashwood, Watson and I shall be at Blackthorn Manor tomorrow morning. Be so good as to telegraph ahead and ensure that no one disturbs the study. Tell Inspector Marvell nothing of our coming. Is there a guest room available?" "There are 12, Mr. Holmes. Blackthorn Manor is a substantial house." "Excellent. Then we shall require only 2 of them. I suggest you take the evening train back and ensure that the servants' movements over the past week are not permitted to blur in their own memories. Ask no questions yourself. Simply observe." He rose, signalling that the interview was concluded. "One last matter. Who are the current occupants of Blackthorn Manor beyond yourself?" Miss Ashwood rose as well, drawing on her gloves. "Sir Reginald's nephew, Mr. Philip Ashford, arrived from London 2 days before Sir Reginald's death, unexpectedly and without prior notice. Sir Reginald's ward, Miss Elspeth Torrance, who has lived at the manor since the age of 12, the head butler, Farrow, and his wife who serves as housekeeper, the manservant Crowe, a cook and 3 maids, and in the gatehouse, an elderly man named Dodd, who served as Sir Reginald's gamekeeper these 30 years. And which of these individuals showed the strongest reaction at Sir Reginald's death?" Miss Ashwood paused at the door, something complicated moving across her composed features. "Mr. Ashford wept most loudly and at greatest length, but it was young Miss Torrance who troubled me. She showed no emotion whatsoever, Mr. Holmes, not one tear, and she was the first, before even Crowe, to ask about the contents of Sir Reginald's will." Chapter 2. The Fog-Wrapped Manor. We departed Paddington on the 8:15 express the following morning, arriving at the small market town of Ledbury shortly before noon. Holmes was in one of his mercurial moods, entirely silent for the first hour, then suddenly brilliant and voluble, expounding upon the psychology of blackmail with such precision and such evident relish that our fellow passenger, a prosperous-looking draper, retreated behind his copy of the Times with visible anxiety. By the time we transferred to the local branch line that would deposit us at the tiny halt serving Blackthorn village, Holmes had retreated into silence once more, watching the rolling Herefordshire countryside slip past the rain-streaked windows with those pale, unrevealing eyes. Blackthorn Manor stood approximately 2 miles from the village, accessible by a private lane that wound through dense stands of ancient oak. The house itself, when it came into view through the trees, was precisely the sort of establishment that impresses one by weight and duration rather than elegance. It was a broad, grey-stone Jacobean pile of 3 stories, its east wing substantially newer than the main body of the house, the whole surrounded by grounds that had once been well tended but showed, upon closer inspection, the subtle signs of economies made: hedges not quite perfectly clipped, gravel paths with weeds beginning to assert themselves at the margins. A November mist clung about the lower fields, and the house emerged from it like something dreamed rather than built. Miss Ashwood met us at the door. She had composed herself further since yesterday and introduced us crisply to Farrow, the butler, a tall, dry man of 60, with a manner that managed to be simultaneously respectful and faintly supercilious, as if he were doing us the considerable honour of permitting our presence beneath this roof. "Inspector Marvell has been again this morning," Miss Ashwood murmured to Holmes as Farrow withdrew to arrange our rooms. "He is not pleased by your coming. He has made that clear." "Inspector Marvell's pleasure is not my primary concern," said Holmes equably. "We shall require the study first. After that, I shall wish to speak with Crowe. Has the room been left as it was found?" I insisted upon it, over the inspector's objections. Capital. Lead on. Sir Reginald Blackthorn's study was on the first floor, at the end of a long corridor hung with the portraits of several generations of Blackthorns, each face growing progressively less distinguished as one moved toward the present, as if vitality were a quality the family had slowly spent. The room itself was large, book-lined, and smelling faintly of old leather, tobacco, and something else that Holmes detected the moment we crossed the threshold, lifting his head like a hound catching a scent. "Watson," he said quietly, "what do you make of that?" I inhaled carefully. Beneath the familiar odours of a well-used gentleman's study was something else, faint, sweet, and slightly medicinal. "Almonds," I said, then caught myself. "No, not almonds exactly. Something similar, but not quite." "Not quite," Holmes agreed. He moved directly to the window. It was, as Miss Ashwood had described, fastened from within. The old iron catch turned firmly down, rust undisturbed. He examined the fireplace, then the desk, then crouched to examine the floor with his lens, moving methodically across the carpet with the absorbed concentration of a man reading a text in a difficult language. The desk was large, leather-topped, with pigeonholes for correspondence and 3 deep drawers on each side. An oil lamp, burned out, stood at the right corner. A silver inkstand had been knocked sideways, not overturned, but displaced, as if by a convulsive movement. The chair behind the desk was a heavy leather affair on casters, and it had been pushed back at an angle, suggesting that its occupant had lurched backward suddenly. "He was seated when it struck him," Holmes murmured, half to himself. "He rose partially, see the caster's track, then fell back. Whatever he experienced, it came upon him swiftly but was not instantaneous." He bent closer to the lamp. "Watson, look at the glass chimney of this lamp." I examined it. On the inner surface of the glass, near the top, was a faint dark residue, barely visible, a thin ring of discoloration. "Soot," I hazarded. "Soot can take many forms. This residue is not uniformly distributed, as soot from simple burning would be. It is concentrated in a narrow band and appears greasy in character." He straightened, his eyes very bright. "And there is something else. Come here." He led me to the corner of the room, near the small armchair positioned beside the cold fireplace, and directed my attention to the hearthrug. There, Almost invisible against the dark wool of the rug's border was a small circular impression, not quite a footprint, more like the base of a small cylindrical object set down with some force. A cane end, I suggested. Possibly, but note the diameter, consistent with a small metal container, a tin of modest circumference, and observe. He produced a white handkerchief and pressed it briefly to the rug in and around the impression, then held it to the light. A faint waxy smear was visible. The carpet retains traces of whatever substance was present here. I shall analyze it this evening. I watched him with the familiar mixture of admiration and slight bafflement that Holmes's investigations always inspired in me. He was gathering threads I could not yet see the shape of, weaving them into a pattern whose design remained entirely opaque to me. I knew better than to press him at this stage. "One more thing," he said, returning to the desk and crouching before the cold fireplace. The grate had been cleaned, swept by a servant in the ordinary course of housekeeping, but Holmes trained his lens upon the iron fireback with great care. "Someone attempted to burn papers here," he said. "Not recently, 2 or 3 days ago, by the oxidation of the ash remnants that escaped the sweeping, and not entirely successfully." From the narrow gap between the fireback and the grate, he extracted with a penknife a fragment of paper no larger than my thumbnail, charred at all edges but with a few lines of text still legible in faded brown ink. He pocketed it without showing it to me. That, too, was characteristic. Chapter 3. The Inhabitants of Sorrow Luncheon. At Blackthorn Manor was a subdued and uncomfortable affair. The dining room was large enough that the 6 of us, Holmes, myself, Miss Ashwood, Mr. Philip Ashford, Miss Elspeth Torrance, and Dr. Finch, who had been invited by Miss Ashwood, seemed rather stranded among all that dark mahogany and silver. The empty chairs of the household's reduced circumstances ranged about us like ghosts of more prosperous entertainments. Mr. Philip Ashford was a man of 35, with dark hair oiled flat, and features that might have been called handsome if his expression had not been so persistently aggrieved. He was Sir Reginald's late brother's son, he informed us, and had been on terms of the warmest affection with his uncle. This claim sat somewhat awkwardly with the information Miss Ashwood had provided, that his arrival at the manor had been unexpected and had caused Sir Reginald visible displeasure. But Holmes received it without visible scepticism, merely nodding politely while his eyes moved about the room with their habitual cataloguing attention. "Scotland Yard sends a detective now," said Ashford, buttering his bread with the precise movements of a man restraining his temper. I had not realized that natural causes warranted such attention. "Watson and I are not from Scotland Yard," Holmes replied pleasantly. "We are here at Miss Ashwood's invitation, and as friends of the family, in the broadest sense." "I trust you have no objection." "None at all." The speed and flatness of the denial suggested several objections carefully suppressed. Miss Elspeth Torrance sat across from Ashford and maintained throughout the meal the peculiar still watchfulness that Miss Ashwood had remarked upon. She was a young woman of perhaps 23, with red-brown hair, a composed oval face, and eyes of an unusual amber shade that made her seem, oddly, like a creature of an entirely different order from the rest of us. Calmer, more deliberate, as though she observed the world through very thick glass. She ate sparingly and spoke little, but when she did speak, her observations were precise and her vocabulary educated. She had been, I gathered, the object of considerable care from Sir Reginald, educated abroad, given every advantage, and she acknowledged this with a sort of formal gratitude that had about it no warmth whatsoever. "Miss Torrance," Holmes said pleasantly, addressing her directly for the first time, "I understand you were Sir Reginald's ward from a young age. You must have known him as well as anyone." "Better than most," she said, without inflection. "A considerable loss, then." She looked at him steadily. "Every loss is considerable, Mr. Holmes, when one has few things to lose." Dr. Finch, who sat at Holmes's left, was a red-faced country physician of 50, hearty and somewhat defensive. The defensiveness, I suspected, of a man aware that a London detective's presence implicitly questioned the adequacy of his own investigation. He had certified the cause of death as cardiac failure due to acute emotional disturbance, he informed us, and he stood by that certification entirely. The evidence is conclusive, he said, addressing his mutton with vigour. The locked room, the absence of any wound or poison, the known temperament of the deceased. Sir Reginald was a man of powerful emotions, and the stresses of his position were considerable. I have seen men younger and healthier than he, struck down by no more than a sudden shock. The stresses of his position? Holmes inquired. Finch glanced briefly at Ashford. Financial stresses, among others. Blackthorn Manor is not, shall we say, the thriving estate it once was. Sir Reginald had made certain investments in recent years that had not proved rewarding. And these investments were known within the household? They were known to those with eyes to see, said Miss Ashwood quietly, and something in her tone caused both Ashford and Miss Torrance to look at her with sharply different expressions. Ashford's one of quick, calculating assessment, Miss Torrance's unreadable. After luncheon, Holmes requested an interview with Crow, the manservant. We were shown to a small sitting room off the main hall, and Crow was sent to us there. He was a compact man of 45, with a cropped grey head and the careful, unreadable manner common to long-serving household staff, servants who have learned to see everything and reveal nothing. He had been with Sir Reginald for 18 years, he told us, first as under footman, then as personal manservant. He had been devoted to his master. His eyes, which were dark and somewhat deep-set, moved from Holmes to me and back with a wariness that was not, I thought, the mere nervousness of a man unused to inquiry. On the evening Sir Reginald died, Holmes began, without preliminary. You were the last person to see him. Describe the circumstances precisely. Crow folded his hands in his lap. I brought Sir Reginald his evening whisky at 9:30, as was customary. He was at his desk, writing. He seemed preoccupied. Not distressed exactly, but not at ease. He dismissed me more briefly than usual. He said, "That will do, Crow," which he sometimes said when he wished to be alone with his thoughts. Did he say anything else? A brief hesitation, brief, but Holmes caught it, for I saw his eyes sharpen. He asked me if there had been any visitors to the manor that afternoon, any who had arrived without being announced. And had there? Not to my knowledge. I told him so. And his response? Crow was quiet for a moment. He said, "Good. Lock the front and back gates at 10, tonight especially." Those were his exact words. Tonight especially. Holmes leaned back, tapping his fingertips together. One more question, Crow. The lamp in the study, the oil lamp on the desk. Was it full when you last cleaned and filled it? Crow seemed surprised by the question. Yes, sir. I filled it myself that afternoon. It would have burned 4, perhaps 5 hours on a full reservoir. And when you broke down the door the following morning, the reservoir was bone dry, sir, burned entirely out. Though Sir Reginald retired, that is, died, well before midnight, we believe. Holmes smiled, a thin, satisfied expression that he directed at the middle distance rather than at Crow. Thank you. That will be all. When Crow had gone, I turned to Holmes. The lamp was burning for far longer than it should have been, he said, rising and moving to the window to look out at the grey November parkland. Which means either the lamp was burning before Crow filled it, impossible, as he filled it that afternoon, or it was burning all night, which means Sir Reginald was alive, or someone was in that room, for considerably longer than we have been led to believe. Chapter 4. The Shadow of the Winter of 71. Holmes spent the remainder of that afternoon in a manner that would have seemed entirely purposeless to any observer not acquainted with his methods. He wandered the grounds of Blackthorn Manor in the thin November drizzle, hands thrust deep in his overcoat pockets, collar turned up, apparently absorbed in nothing more particular than a contemplation of the bare-branched oaks. I accompanied him, having learned long since that Holmes's apparent aimlessness was almost always the outward expression of intense internal calculation. In fact, he was observing the layout of the estate with great precision, the position of the gatehouse relative to the main house, the drainage channels at the base of the east wing, the narrow path that wound from the rear of the kitchen garden to the wood's edge. Twice he paused to examine the ground, and once crouched to press the earth at the base of the garden wall with his thumb, testing its moisture and consistency in a way I could not interpret. "Tell me, Watson," he said, as we turned back toward the house along the kitchen garden path, "what do you make of old Dodd?" I had encountered the gamekeeper briefly near the stables, a weathered, rheumatic man of perhaps 70, who had touched his hat to us with the ingrained courtesy of a lifetime's service and regarded Holmes's questions about the grounds with a wary reserve. "He seems a faithful old retainer," I said. "He has been here longer than almost anyone. I should think he knew Sir Reginald as well as Crowe." "He knew Sir Reginald before Crowe ever came to the household," Holmes said. 30 years, Miss Ashwood said. "That takes us back to 1863 at the earliest. And the note spoke of the winter of 1871. Dodd was present for whatever occurred then." He paused at the garden gate. "Watson, I want you to visit Dodd this evening on some pretext. Tell him you wish to know about the shooting, or the state of the coverts, anything that a country gentleman might naturally inquire about. Encourage him to speak of the old days. Note anything he says about Sir Reginald's past, about any associates of that period, about anything unusual that occurred in that winter. You will not come yourself. Dodd will be more forthcoming with you. You have, if you will forgive the observation, a manner of comfortable, unchallenging amiability that makes men talk. My presence tends to make people feel they are being dissected. I could not entirely dispute this. And what will you be doing? I shall be having a conversation with Miss Torrance that she does not know is an interview, and examining certain items from the study that I have brought with me in my coat pocket." He patted the breast of his overcoat. "And this evening, after dinner, I wish to send a telegram to Mycroft. There are matters concerning the history of the Blackthorn family that only the government's more comprehensive records are likely to illuminate." I visited Dodd at the gatehouse after tea, presenting myself with the cover story Holmes had suggested. The old gamekeeper was more forthcoming than I had expected. A garrulous man once his reserve was breached, with the storyteller's instinct of those who have lived long in isolated places. His cottage was warm and cluttered, smelling of gun oil and dogs, and he sat me down before a well-made fire and talked with the easy volubility of a man grateful for company. He spoke of Sir Reginald with the peculiar affection that long service breeds, critical in small things, loyal in large ones. Sir Reginald had been a man of forceful character, he said, not always easy, but just. He had managed the estate well in his middle years. The difficulties had come later, after he came back from abroad, Dodd said, without being asked. "He travelled abroad?" I encouraged. "Oh, aye. He was away a good 18 months, in the early 70s. Business he never fully explained. He went to South America, Brazil or thereabouts, and came back a changed man, quieter, more careful. He had money, though, considerably more than he'd left with, and none of us quite understood how, given the state of the family's affairs when he departed." "Did he bring anyone back with him?" Dodd's eyes grew careful. "He brought back a child, a little red-haired girl, 4 or 5 years old, told no one who she was or where she'd come from, said she was the daughter of a business associate who had died, and that he had undertaken to provide for her. That would be Miss Elspeth." He paused, poking the fire. "There were stories, of course. There always are, in a small place. But Sir Reginald was not a man you questioned." I pressed as gently as I could on the matter of the winter of 1871, but here Dodd grew suddenly, markedly cautious, the shutters coming down behind his eyes with a swiftness that told me Holmes's instinct had been correct. Something had occurred in that winter, and Dodd knew of it, and had kept that knowledge for 30 years. He deflected my questions with the practiced ease of a man who has been deflecting them for a long time, and presently I took my leave, having gathered at least the thread that Holmes needed. At dinner, Holmes was quiet but attentive, watching the table's dynamics with those grey, cataloguing eyes. Ashford drank rather more than was wise and grew increasingly talkative, describing his business affairs in London. Import and export, he said, with a vagueness that suggested the import and export of a particular kind of confidence and very little else. Miss Torrance ate in her usual deliberate silence, and it was only when Ashford made a remark about the estate's future, a remark just too casual to be accidental, that she looked up and fixed him with those amber eyes in a way that silenced him completely. After dinner, Holmes disappeared briefly to send his telegram. When he returned, his expression was thoughtful but controlled, the expression of a man who has confirmed a suspicion but found it to be something larger than he had supposed. "Mycroft is useful in precise measure," he told me quietly, as we sat with our port. "He has confirmed one thing and raised an entirely new question. The Blackthorn family had a legal matter in 1871, a matter of considerable gravity that was resolved privately, outside the courts, and of which all official record is thin to the point of non-existence. That, as Mycroft remarks, is itself informative. How so? Because the erasure of a legal matter requires both money and influence. Sir Reginald had influence. In 1871, he apparently acquired money. The question is, what was bought and sold in that transaction, and who, besides Sir Reginald, knew the price? Chapter 5. The Nephew's Urgency. The second morning at Blackthorn Manor brought with it a sharp frost that silvered the dead grass and hung from the bare branches in thin, glittering needles. I rose early and found Holmes already gone from his room, a circumstance I had ceased to find remarkable. He had a habit of nocturnal industry at critical points in an investigation, moving through the sleeping hours like a ghost with a purpose, and I had learned not to inquire too precisely into these activities until he was ready to share their fruits. I encountered Philip Ashford at breakfast, alone and nursing what appeared to be a formidable headache earned by the previous evening's indulgence. In the morning light, stripped of dinner-table performance, he looked what he was, a man under considerable pressure, wearing the mask of ease rather badly. He greeted me with the mechanical civility of someone who has been brought up to be polite regardless of inclination. "Your friend Mr. Holmes," he said, as I helped myself to eggs and sat across from him. "He is not here simply as a friend of the family, is he?" "Holmes rarely goes anywhere without purpose," I said, which was true enough. Ashford set down his cup with a small, deliberate click. "I should be candid with you, Dr. Watson. I came to Blackthorn Manor because I was worried about my uncle. Not for the reasons your friend has no doubt supposed. I did not come to press him about the inheritance or to quarrel about money, though I am sure that is how it has been represented to you." He glanced at the door, as if ensuring we were alone. "I came because I received a letter." "What sort of letter?" "Anonymous. Written on plain paper in a hand I did not recognize. It told me that my uncle was in danger, that someone was about to make demands upon him that he would be unable to resist, and that if I valued Sir Reginald's safety, I should come to the manor at once." He looked at me steadily. "I did come, but I arrived too late, or not late enough. I am no longer certain which. You showed this letter to Inspector Marvell. I told Marvell about it. He dismissed it as irrelevant, the fabrication of an overwrought mind," he said. He was considerably less interested in the letter than in satisfying himself that my uncle had died of natural causes and closing the matter before the coroner's inquest became inconvenient for anyone. "Do you still have the letter?" Ashford hesitated, again that quality of calculation that seemed to be his default mode, then reached inside his morning coat and produced a crumpled envelope. I examined it carefully, noting the postmark, London, 3 days before his arrival at the manor, the plain paper, the scratching pen hand. Then I set it down and looked at Ashford directly. "Mr. Ashford, I shall be equally candid with you. Holmes does not believe your uncle died of natural causes. If you have any information that bears on the matter, any knowledge of Sir Reginald's past affairs, his associates, his difficulties, I urge you to share it with us now, rather than later." Something moved across Ashford's face. I had the impression of a man weighing one risk against another. "My uncle had an enemy," he said at last. "Someone from his time abroad, the early 70s, when he was in South America. I do not know the details. My uncle never spoke of it directly. But I know that over the years, certain payments were made, quarterly, regular, substantial. My father, Sir Reginald's brother, who managed the estate accounts for a period in the 80s, referred to them as the South American obligation. He never knew more than that. But the payments went on, and they were the reason the estate had its difficulties. Not failed investments, as Finch supposes, or rather, the failed investments were themselves a consequence of monies regularly drained from the estate to meet this obligation. "Blackmail," I said quietly. "For 30 years," said Ashford. "And then, apparently, the blackmailer decided that 30 years of quarterly payments was insufficient and decided to collect the whole debt at once." I brought this conversation to Holmes the moment I found him, which was in the estate gun room, examining with great care a rack of 12-bore shotguns that would not have seemed to any observer to have any connection with the case. He listened to my account with his head slightly bowed and his eyes fixed on the middle distance, and when I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Good," he said simply. "That confirms the financial mechanism. The note spoke of a debt falling due. This was not metaphorical. The blackmailer had allowed the quarterly arrangement to be replaced by a final, terminal demand, which suggests either that the blackmailer's circumstances had changed and they needed a large sum immediately, or that they intended this to be the last transaction before making the secret public regardless of payment. Which would mean the payment was not the point. The payment was never the point, Holmes said, setting down the gun he had been examining with curious attentiveness. "Watson, one of these guns has been recently cleaned. Not all of them, only this one. Can you see the difference?" I looked along the rack. The guns were all well maintained. This was a household that had kept up its sporting appointments, even as other economies were made. But Holmes was right. One barrel caught the thin winter light differently from the others, with the bright, freshly oiled gleam of very recent attention. "Someone cleaned it in the last day or two," I said. "In the last 12 hours, I should estimate." He set it back precisely in its bracket and turned to me. "Now, come. I wish to look at the gatehouse again, and I want your medical opinion on something I noticed last night." Chapter 6. What the Ashes Told. The afternoon brought with it one of those fugitive gleams of November sunshine that illuminate more than they warm, laying a cold, clear light across the grounds of Blackthorn Manor and picking out every detail of the frosted landscape with merciless precision. Holmes had set up a small chemical apparatus in our shared sitting room, brought in a leather case from Baker Street, as he always brought it, with the easy foresight of long experience, and was engaged in the analysis of the waxy material he had scraped from the hearthrug in the study when I came to him after my own investigations. I had spent 2 hours in the Manor's library, at Holmes's suggestion, examining the bound volumes of estate accounts that sat, dusty and undisturbed, in the lower shelves. What I found there confirmed Ashford's account in every particular. From 1873 onward, there appeared in the accounts, rendered in Sir Reginald's own careful hand, a quarterly entry designated simply RM, an abbreviation that appeared nowhere else in the records and which corresponded to no identifiable estate expenditure. The sums were substantial and grew gradually larger over the decades, reaching in the final years an amount that explained entirely why Blackthorn Manor showed signs of financial strain. The last entry was dated the 1st of October of the current year. After that, nothing, until death, 3 weeks later. Holmes listened to this without apparent surprise. RM, he repeated, and the initials remained constant throughout the entire run of 30 years. He nodded slowly and returned his attention to the analysis before him. Sit down, Watson. I shall explain what I have found, and you shall tell me what it suggests to your medical knowledge. He gestured toward the window seat. The waxy residue from the hearthrug is a compound I recognize but did not expect. It is a preparation based on spermaceti, a substance used in the making of certain types of candles and, more relevantly, certain types of pharmaceutical preparations in the mid-century. He held up the glass slide on which the residue rested. It is also a component of a particular class of fumigating compound, preparations burned to release active substances into a closed space. I sat very still. A fumigant, I said. You mean something was burned in that room? Not in the fireplace, or not primarily. The lamp. The lamp reservoir contains something other than or in addition to lamp oil. Substances can be dissolved in oil in such a way as to be released when the oil is burned, slowly, over the course of several hours, into the air of a closed room. He looked at me directly. The smell of almonds, Watson. What substance produces that odor when burned or heated? The answer came to me with a small, cold shock. Prussic acid, hydrogen cyanide in solution, or substances that release it upon heating. There are organic compounds, certain nitrile preparations, that decompose under heat to release cyanide in gaseous form, slowly and steadily. In a well-sealed room with a burning lamp, the windows latched, the door locked from within, the fireplace cold and its damper closed, such a preparation would produce a concentration lethal within 3 to 5 hours. He paused, without any trace more obvious than the smell of almonds, which by morning would have largely dissipated, particularly if someone opened the room. The expression of horror on Sir Reginald's face, consistent with cyanide poisoning, the dry lamp reservoir, the oil burned all night as the substance was consumed, the absence of any wound or external trauma, entirely consistent. It is murder, I said. It is exceptionally clever, premeditated murder. The locked room was not a mystery. Sir Reginald locked it himself, from within, unaware that his lamp had been prepared in advance. The killer needed only access to the study at some point before 9:30, when Crow delivered the evening whiskey. The substance was introduced into the lamp reservoir, mixed with the oil in sufficient dilution that it did not immediately betray itself. When Crow filled the lamp that afternoon, he was filling it with a prepared mixture. Either the killer had already treated the oil, or had substituted the oil entirely with a prepared solution. But Crow filled the lamp. Crow filled the lamp from the oil can kept in the study cupboard. I examined that can last night. He produced a small glass vial containing a few drops of amber liquid. This is from the oil remaining in the can. I have just confirmed it carries the same compound as the residue on the rug. Someone adulterated the oil in the can before Crow used it. The killer never needed to touch the lamp itself. Chapter 7. Amber Eyes and Hidden Ledgers. Holmes was not prepared to reveal his conclusions to anyone in the household. Not yet. This was characteristic of his method. He moved through investigations the way a chess player approaches the middle game, never showing his full position until the board was set precisely as he wished. What he needed now, he told me as we dressed for dinner that evening, was a clearer understanding of the relationships between the various parties, the web of connection and dependency that would eventually reveal who, among the inhabitants of Blackthorn Manor, had both the motive and the opportunity to prepare that lamp. I had my own theories, but I kept them to myself for the moment. Over dinner, Holmes engaged Miss Torrance in a conversation that appeared, to the casual observer, to be nothing more than the polite exchange of a guest making himself agreeable to his hostess. But I knew Holmes, and I watched with attention as he guided the conversation through subjects that seemed random but were not. Brazil in the 70s, the management of estates, the responsibilities of guardianship, the law as it pertained to wards and inheritance. Miss Torrance answered each gambit with the same composed directness she brought to all things. She had been born in Brazil, she said. In response to Holmes's apparently casual question about the warmth of the South American climate, she had been told so, though she remembered nothing of it. She had no knowledge of her parents. Sir Reginald had brought her to England when she was very small. "And you have always been content at Blackthorn Manor?" Holmes asked pleasantly. "Content is a comfortable word," she said. "I have been provided for, educated. I am grateful for that." "Gratitude and contentment are different things," Holmes observed. "Yes," she said, very simply, and looked at him with those amber eyes that seemed to see somewhat further into things than was always comfortable. "They are." After dinner, while the others withdrew to the drawing-room, Holmes contrived to detain Miss Torrance for a private word. I watched from the doorway as he spoke to her quietly, and I saw something happen in her face that I had not seen there before. A crack in the composure, swift and quickly sealed, like a hairline fracture in fine porcelain. Whatever Holmes said to her, she listened without moving, and then she nodded once, curtly, and walked with steady steps to the drawing-room. Holmes joined me in the corridor, his expression grave. "She knows something," he said. "She has known something for years. I am not certain she knows what it is, only that it exists." He was quiet for a moment. "She is not who she is believed to be, Watson, or rather, she is exactly who she is, but the story told about her is false in its essentials." "What do you mean?" "I mean that a 4-year-old child brought from Brazil with no papers, no explanation, installed in an English manor house at the private expense of a wealthy man with a secret. That is not the story of a business associate's orphaned daughter. That is an entirely different story." He straightened and looked at me with an expression I could not quite read. "And it bears on everything. The motive is not simply the suppression of a past crime. It is the suppression of an identity." I stared at him. "She is his daughter, or something near it. The money taken out of South America, the child brought back, the quarterly payments made to someone who knew the truth. All of it fits a pattern I have seen before. A man with an illegitimate child, and someone who knows it, and 30 years of keeping that knowledge out of the light." He moved toward the library. "Come. There is a ledger I want to examine more carefully. Mycroft's telegram this afternoon added a piece I had not expected." Chapter 5. The Message in the Margins. Mycroft Holmes's telegram, received that afternoon by arrangement at the village post office and retrieved by Holmes himself, contained, in that elder brother's compressed and laconic style, a remarkable amount of information in a very few words. I read it over Holmes's shoulder in the lamplit library while the house settled into its evening quiet around us. Blackthorn RM. Consistent with Rosa Montero. Brazil identity confirmed. Passenger records, 1873. Stop legal matter, 71. Involved partnership dispute resolution private. Stop one other party to resolution. Now London suggest check hotel records. December year. Stop. Ashwood family connection interests you. Mycroft Holmes read it twice, set it on the table, and pressed his fingertips together in silence for a full minute. "Rosa Montero," I said. "RM. The initials in the accounts. A woman. The blackmailer was a woman, or the payments were made to a woman." He rose and began to pace, a sure sign that the pieces were arranging themselves into a pattern. The partnership dispute of 1871, the erased legal matter. 2 parties, Sir Reginald and another. They resolved something privately. In 1873, Sir Reginald returned from Brazil with money and a child, and the quarterly payments began. To Rosa Montero. He paused. The payments ceased in October. The final demand came in November. Sir Reginald died on the 30th. And Mycroft's reference to Miss Ashwood's family connection? Holmes turned to look at me. That is what I had not expected. Cordelia Ashwood, our client, Is she related to the Blackthorn family? She is the companion and secretary. She might have taken the name. I stopped. Holmes. Ashwood. Quite. Not a common name, and yet the same name as Philip Ashford, who is Sir Reginald's nephew by his brother. In a family that might have anglicised a foreign name, or adopted a name, it bears examination. He went to the library shelves and ran his finger along the volumes until he found a large, leather-bound family Bible, the standard repository of family records in a Victorian household of this type. He opened it to the flyleaf, where generations of Blackthorns had recorded births, marriages and deaths in careful copperplate. He studied it for some time, tracing lines of descent with his finger, his expression growing very still and very focused. Then he turned the book so that I could see. The entry was there, recorded in a different hand from the others. Newer ink, a more recent edition, but set in the chronological order that suggested it had been inserted, rather than added, at the time of the events it recorded. In the year 1873, in the space following Sir Reginald Blackthorn's name, issue, one daughter, Elspeth, born Brazil, mother Rosa Montero, legitimacy uncertain. Brought to England November 1873. Below it, a later hand, Sir Reginald's own, I thought, from comparison with other samples, had written a single sentence. The obligation of blood, however long deferred, does not expire. He wrote this himself, I said. He knew she was his daughter. He always knew. He brought her here. He educated her. He provided for her in every practical sense. Holmes closed the Bible and replaced it exactly as he had found it. But he never acknowledged her publicly. He could not. The circumstances of her birth involved the very secret for which he was being blackmailed, and public acknowledgement would have destroyed him as surely as exposure. He paused. And now Sir Reginald is dead, and the estate passes to Philip Ashford as the acknowledged male heir, and Miss Elspeth Torrance, his own daughter, receives whatever modest provision was made for her in the will, without knowledge of her true claim. Unless the will contains a surprise. Unless the will contains a surprise. Which is why, Watson, it is essential that I speak with the solicitor tomorrow morning before anyone else does. Chapter 9. The Shape of the Trap. Sir Reginald Blackthorn's solicitor was a Mr. Cornelius Hatch of the firm Hatch, Drummond and Weir, whose offices were situated in Hereford, some 15 miles from Blackthorn Manor. Holmes dispatched a telegram early the following morning, and we drove into Hereford in the Manor's trap, a journey of some 40 minutes through lanes that wound between fields of frost-bitten stubble under a pale winter sky. Hatch received us in a panelled office that smelled of old documents and caution. He was a lean, dry man of 60, with the characteristic reserve of a solicitor who has kept important people's secrets for a long time and developed, in consequence, a highly refined economy of expression. He was not pleased by the intrusion, but Holmes's reputation was sufficient to induce at least cautious cooperation. "I can tell you," said Hatch, after Holmes had explained the nature of his inquiries with more frankness than I had expected, that Sir Reginald Blackthorn made significant alterations to his will approximately 6 weeks before his death. These alterations represented a substantial departure from the provisions of the previous instrument. "In what direction?" Holmes asked. Hatch hesitated. "The previous will left the estate, with its entailed properties and the main house, to his nephew Philip Ashford, with modest bequests to the household staff and an annuity to Miss Torrance. The revised will," he paused again, with the air of a man about to impart something significant. "The revised will still leaves the estate to Ashford, but introduces a provision I had never previously encountered in 40 years of practice. It establishes a trust for a person described as my natural daughter, Elspeth Torrance, whose birth and parentage I now formally acknowledge, and grants to that trust a sum of money and certain unentailed properties of considerable value. considerably more than Ashford receives from the estate itself. He acknowledged her, I said. In legal terms, yes. The will, when read, will effectively constitute a public acknowledgement. The family name is not transferred. Her name remains Torrance, but the blood relationship is stated unambiguously, with supporting documentation lodged with this office. Hatch looked at us over his spectacles. I understood at the time that this revision was prompted by a private matter Sir Reginald was resolving. He was, in his way, a conscientious man who was making, perhaps late in life, an attempt to set matters right. Holmes leaned forward. "And when is the will to be read?" "Formally, on the 15th of next month, when all interested parties can be convened." Informally, Hatch permitted himself the very slight ghost of a smile. "The contents are known to Miss Torrance herself. Sir Reginald informed her personally. At the same time he revised the document. She has known for 6 weeks that she is his acknowledged daughter, and that she has been substantially provided for." "And Ashford?" Holmes asked sharply. "Mr. Ashford was informed by letter that he remained a beneficiary, but that other provisions had been made. He was given no details. He knew he stood to lose something, without knowing what." The drive back to Blackthorn Manor was largely silent. Holmes sat with his arms folded, eyes fixed on the hedgerows, working through the implications of what we had learned, with a focused intensity that made conversation seem beside the point. I attempted to arrange my own thoughts. "The picture is coming clear," I said at last. Ashford received the solicitor's letter and came to the manor to discover what had changed. The blackmailer, Rosa Montero, or someone acting in her name, chose the same period to make the final demand. Sir Reginald, under pressure from both directions, was in the process of resolving everything, acknowledging his daughter, paying off the blackmailer, setting the record straight. "And someone prevented him from doing so," Holmes said. "The question is why, and by whom? Ashford stands to lose the most by the will's revelation. He does, but does he have the knowledge to have prepared that lamp? Does he have the scientific expertise to obtain and dissolve a cyanide-releasing compound in lamp oil?" Holmes shook his head slowly. "The preparation of that lamp required specific knowledge of chemistry, of the relevant compounds, of their dosage and delivery. Ashford is many things, but I have seen no evidence of scientific training." "Then who?" "Someone with medical or chemical knowledge. Someone with access to the study over an extended period. Someone who knew precisely the details of Sir Reginald's evening routine." He looked at me. "Someone who has been at Blackthorn Manor for years, Watson. Not a visitor, a resident." Chapter 10. A Game of Shadows. That evening, Holmes set his trap. He had spent the late afternoon in what appeared to be aimless conversation with various members of the household, but which I now recognized as the delicate, systematic business of planting seeds, introducing ideas, implying that certain facts were known, creating the conditions under which the person he sought would feel compelled to act. He was particularly attentive to Crow, with whom he spent nearly an hour in the gun-room, and to Miss Ashwood, whom he visited in her small sitting-room on the upper floor, with a request to examine Sir Reginald's personal correspondence files. At dinner, Holmes made a remark, seemingly casual, easily missed, that Sir Reginald had kept a private journal. He did not elaborate. He did not name the journal or claim to have found it. He merely mentioned it, in the course of a general comment about the difficulty of reconstructing a dead man's state of mind, and then moved the conversation elsewhere. But I watched the faces around the table as he spoke, and I saw what I was meant to see. Ashford's reaction was studied, too controlled, the reaction of a man who had been expecting something of this kind and had prepared for it. Miss Torrance looked briefly sharply at Holmes, then at her plate. Crow, serving at the sideboard, became very still for a fraction of a second before resuming his movements. Miss Ashwood showed no reaction at all, which was itself a reaction, when one knew what to look for. "There is no journal," I murmured to Holmes as we sat with our port after the ladies had withdrawn. Ashford had excused himself with a headache. Genuine or manufactured, I could not determine. There may well be a journal, Holmes said equably. Sir Reginald was a man of systematic habits, but whether or not there is, it scarcely matters. What matters is that several people in this house now believe there may be, and that if it exists, it may contain information damaging to them. One of those people will attempt to search for it before morning. And you intend to catch them in the act? I intend to observe them. He rose. I have taken certain precautions with the study. Come, I shall show you your post. He had arranged things with considerable ingenuity. The study door was to remain unlocked, ostensibly at Holmes's request, on the grounds that he wished to continue his examination at any hour. Within the room itself, he had placed a small piece of paper under the leading edge of the desk's central drawer, one of the oldest and most reliable of his alarm methods. The lamp oil can in the cupboard bore a fine dusting of French chalk on its handle. The blotter's corner had been turned down at a precise angle. I was to remain in the chair in the alcove of my bedroom, which shared a wall with the study corridor, ready to respond to a signal. Holmes himself would be in the study's shadows, behind the heavy curtain of the window embrasure, from 11 o'clock onward. At midquarter midnight, I heard it, so faint as to be almost imaginary, a soft tread in the corridor outside my door. I waited, counting breaths, as Holmes had instructed. Then silence. The silence of someone who has stopped. Then, very quietly, the creak of the study door. I gave Holmes 30 seconds, as we had agreed, before slipping from my chair and moving to the corridor. The study door was ajar, and through the gap came the faint glow of a shielded lantern, someone moving with careful economy of light, keeping the beam close to the floor. I pushed the door open silently and stepped inside. The figure was at the desk, pulling open the central drawer with a hand from which the shield of the lantern threw a wavering light across pale features, the composed, controlled features of Cordelia Ashwood. At that moment, Holmes stepped forward from the window embrasure. His voice, when he spoke, was very quiet and entirely without surprise. "Miss Ashwood, I had expected you an hour ago. You are more patient than I gave you credit for." Chapter 11. The Revelation of Rosa. Miss Ashwood did not scream, or faint, or flee. She straightened with the same composed dignity she had shown throughout, set the lantern on the desk, and looked at Holmes with an expression that was not, I thought, fear. Or not primarily fear. It was something closer to exhaustion. The exhaustion of a person who has been carrying a great weight for a very long time and has at last been allowed to set it down. "You knew," she said, "when you agreed to come here." "I suspected," Holmes said. "I knew with reasonable confidence from the moment Mycroft's telegram mentioned the Ashwood name." He gestured toward the basket chair. "Sit down. Watson, would you be so good as to close the door? We shall not need to make this more public than necessary." She sat. In the lantern's light, she looked older than she had on Baker Street. The composure that had seemed like strength now revealed itself as the particular rigidity of someone who has been controlling themselves so long that control has become the only thing holding them together. "Your name is not Cordelia Ashwood," Holmes said, not unkindly. "Or rather, it is, but it was not always. You were born Rosa Montero Ashworth, the anglicization of the name being made, I suspect, when you came to England some years ago and established yourself in this household. Your mother was Rosa Montero, the blackmailer whose initials appear in Sir Reginald's accounts for 30 years. She was silent for a moment. Then, "My mother is dead. She died 4 years ago. I have been continuing the payments in her name since then, using the correspondence arrangements she established." "You were collecting the blackmail money," I said, understanding hitting me fully. "That is why you came here, not as a companion or secretary, but to continue your mother's work." "I came here because I had no choice," she said, with sudden feeling. "My mother spent 30 years receiving money from Sir Reginald, and never once told me why. She said only that it was owed to her. When she died, I found her papers. I found letters. I found the truth. Her voice remained steady, but the effort of it was visible. He had been my mother's partner. In Brazil, they had built something together, a business, or what he called a business. What it actually was, I will not go into the details. It was not legal, and people were hurt by it. When it came apart, in 1871, Sir Reginald took everything of value and left my mother with nothing but the knowledge of what he had done. And the child. Holmes leaned forward. The child. Miss Torrance. Elspeth is my half-sister, Miss Ashwood said quietly. We have the same father. Sir Reginald fathered her on my mother in Brazil, and then took her away when he fled. My mother was left with nothing except the threat of exposure to keep him paying. She used it. For 30 years she used it, and the money she wrung from him was what kept us alive. She looked at her hands, and then she died, and there was no more money, and I found the letters, and I came here. To continue the blackmail, Holmes said. To see, she said, after a pause, to see what he was, to see my sister, who does not know I exist, to understand what happened to my family. She lifted her eyes to Holmes, and when I came here and saw how it all was, the manor, Sir Reginald, Miss Torrance, I could not simply continue my mother's approach. I sent Sir Reginald the letter, not to extort him, to force a confrontation. I wanted him to face what he had done, to acknowledge Elspeth, to make it right. And instead he died, Holmes said. She met his gaze. I did not kill him, Mr. Holmes. No, Holmes said, very calmly. You did not. I know that. But the question you have not asked me, which is itself instructive, is who did. Chapter 12. The Man in the Gatehouse. The revelation concerning Miss Ashwood reorganized the case so fundamentally that I found myself struggling to follow the new shape of it as Holmes laid it out for me in the early hours of the morning. We had allowed Miss Ashwood to retire to her room. She was not, Holmes had concluded, either a murderer or a flight risk, and arresting her for the blackmail was a matter for later consideration. And now, we sat in the cold study by the light of the properly fueled lamp, and Holmes spoke carefully. Miss Ashwood sent the letter. She made the final demand, not for money, strictly, but for acknowledgement and resolution. Sir Reginald received it, and, for reasons I surmise were related to his own late-developing conscience, decided to comply. He revised his will. He acknowledged Elspeth. He was, in the days before his death, in the process of doing what Ashwood demanded, admitting the truth. Holmes paused, and then someone killed him. To prevent the will's reading, I said, or something more specific than that. The will's revision is known to Miss Torrance and to Ashford in part. The full revelation, the public acknowledgement, the naming of the partnership in Brazil, the details of whatever illegal enterprise Sir Reginald and Rosa Montero engaged in 30 years ago. That revelation, when Sir Reginald himself gave it freely and publicly, would have consequences beyond the mere redistribution of the estate. Criminal consequences? For those still living who were connected to the affair. The partnership was resolved privately in 1871. Mycroft's telegram indicated one other party to the resolution. Sir Reginald is dead. That leaves one other person who participated in whatever occurred in Brazil and in its subsequent concealment. Holmes stood and moved to the fireplace, taking the fragment of burned paper from his pocket, the piece he had extracted from the fireback on our first morning. I have been studying this. The writing is different from Sir Reginald's hand. It is older. The ink is brown with age. This was a kept document, preserved for years and then burned, in a moment of urgency or decision, the night Sir Reginald died. He handed it to me. The legible lines were fragmentary but suggestive. The arrangement with Montero to be maintained as described herein, both parties to remain, and then the edge of the paper. Should either party expose the nature of the partnership, the other is authorized. A formal agreement, I said, between Sir Reginald and another party, committing both to mutual silence. A gentleman's agreement with teeth, each party holding sufficient information to destroy the other, and each therefore bound to silence. Holmes took the fragment back. Sir Reginald burned this agreement the night he died. Why? Because he intended to break it. He was going to speak, to acknowledge everything, and he wanted to free himself of the formal document first. Precisely. And the other party, the second signatory to this agreement, would have known what Sir Reginald's revised will meant. That Sir Reginald was about to speak, that 30 years of mutual guaranteed silence was about to end. Holmes looked at me steadily. And that person had 30 years to develop both the motive and the means to prevent it. I thought of Dodd's careful deflection when I had raised the subject of the winter of 1871, of the old gamekeeper's 30 years of service to Sir Reginald, of his wary eyes and his practised silence, of the gun that had been recently cleaned. Dodd, I said. Dodd was the other partner. Dodd, Holmes confirmed, the faithful old retainer, who has been here precisely because proximity guarantees control, who is trusted implicitly and therefore moves freely throughout the estate, who was Sir Reginald's contemporary and associate before he became his gamekeeper, and who, when Sir Reginald's decision to speak became apparent, perhaps when Sir Reginald confided in him, as old men confide in old companions, found himself facing the exposure of crimes for which, at 70, he could not hope to escape justice. But Dodd is elderly and infirm. Could he have accessed the study, adulterated the lamp oil, without being observed? Holmes smiled, a thin, satisfied expression. He has a key to every outbuilding and interior room on this estate. He has been given that key over the course of 3 decades of unimpeachable service, and he has not always been infirm. The knowledge of how to dissolve certain compounds was likely acquired in his earlier years, in whatever enterprise he and Sir Reginald conducted in Brazil. The chemistry, Watson, is not sophisticated. It requires knowledge, yes, but not laboratory training. It requires patience and a cold nerve, both of which old Dodd has demonstrated for 30 years. Chapter Sigh. Holmes closes the net. The following morning, Holmes acted with the decisive swiftness that characterized his movements when the moment of resolution arrived. He was at breakfast before the household had fully assembled, and by 8 o'clock he had sent a note to Inspector Marvell requesting the inspector's presence at Blackthorn Manor by noon, with, he added, the emphasis of understatement, a constable if one was available. "Are we ready to present the case?" I asked, as we walked in the sharp morning air along the gravel path to the gatehouse. "We are ready to confirm it," Holmes corrected. "The case itself is complete. What remains is to provoke Dodd into an act that removes the final ambiguity." He walked briskly, his breath clouding in the cold air. "I have examined Dodd's cottage. I entered it at 2 this morning while you were sleeping, and I found what I expected, a quantity of a particular compound that I believe, on analysis, will prove to be the source material for the preparation used in the lamp oil. Dodd is not a stupid man, but he has had only a few days to consider his position, and he has not yet had the presence of mind to dispose of it." "How did you—" "The window latch of the gatehouse cottage is loose. I noticed it on our first visit, a matter of moments." He said this with no self-congratulation whatsoever, as if casual nocturnal break-ins were an entirely normal feature of any investigation. More important than the chemical itself, I found in Dodd's winter coat a second piece of paper, the counterpart to the fragment we found in the study's fireback. Sir Reginald burned his copy of the agreement. Dodd kept his. Holmes produced with great care a yellowed folded paper from his breast pocket. I have not opened it here, as the cold air would not be kind to it, but I read it by lantern light in the cottage, and it is everything I suspected, and more. It details not merely a financial partnership, but the specific circumstances of a transaction in 1871 that would, if presented to a court, constitute both fraud and what I can only describe as a form of organized deception directed against certain parties in the Brazilian state that would draw the attention of international legal authorities. We reached the gatehouse. Holmes knocked with his customary decisiveness. Dodd opened the door in his shirt sleeves, and the change in his face when he saw Holmes was very revealing. Not surprise, not the innocent confusion of a guiltless man, but a rapid succession of calculations, assessments, and decisions visible in those deep-set eyes, as clearly as if they had been written on paper. "Mr. Holmes," he said, after a beat of silence. "Good morning, Dodd. I wonder if we might speak with you, privately." Holmes stepped forward, and Dodd, faced with the choice of either yielding or making a scene that would alert the household, stepped back. Inside the cottage, Holmes sat without being invited and looked at Dodd with calm attention. "I know what occurred in Brazil," he said simply. "I know the nature of your partnership with Sir Reginald, and I know what happened in the winter of 1871. I know about the agreement, and I know that you killed Sir Reginald Blackthorn to prevent him from breaking it." Dodd sat down heavily in the chair by the fire. He was very still. Then, slowly, the carapace of the faithful old retainer fell entirely away, and something different was visible underneath. Harder, colder, more calculating than any devoted gamekeeper had the right to be. "How much do you know?" he asked. Not a denial, an assessment. "Enough," Holmes said. "The compound you used is in your coat pocket. The counterpart agreement is in your dresser. The residue in the lamp oil is chemically specific and will be matched. And you were observed." This last was not entirely true. No one had seen Dodd specifically, but it was a calculated gambit, and I watched it land with precision. Dodd looked at his hands. He was going to ruin us both. 30 years we kept the secret. 30 years we both profited from the arrangement. Me in security and employment, him in his silence bought. And then he gets old and he gets his conscience, and he decides he'll speak and damn the consequences. He looked up, and there was in his eyes not remorse but the bitterness of a man who feels he has been betrayed by someone else's morality. I gave him 30 years of loyalty. I kept his secret as he kept mine. He had no right. "A man's life is not a matter of rights," Holmes said quietly. "But that argument is not one I shall need to make. Inspector Marvell will be here at noon." Dodd said nothing for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, and folded his hands in his lap, and became very still. The stillness, I thought, of a man who has been waiting for something for a long time, and is almost relieved, at the last, that it has arrived. Chapter 14. The Unravelled Web. Inspector Marvell arrived at noon in a state of considerable professional displeasure that modulated, over the course of the following 2 hours, into something approaching reluctant respect. Marvell being, at bottom, too honest a man to deny the evidence laid before him, even when it contradicted every conclusion he had cheerfully reached 5 days earlier. Holmes presented the case with the economy and precision of a man who has done the work and wishes to waste no more time than necessary in explaining it. He laid out the facts methodically in the library of Blackthorn Manor, with Marvell, a constable, Miss Ashwood, Miss Torrance, Ashford, Crowe, and Farrow all present, and old Dodd seated at the end of the room, between Marvell's constable and appointed silence. The preparation of the lamp oil, he explained, had required specific knowledge of certain chemical compounds, nitrile preparations that decompose under heat to release hydrogen cyanide in gaseous form. Dodd had acquired this knowledge in Brazil, where he and Sir Reginald had operated a facility of uncertain legality in the early 1870s, a facility that had made use of such chemical processes in its manufacturing operation. The specific compound used was identifiable and present in Dodd's possession. The lamp oil can had been adulterated at some point on the afternoon of Sir Reginald's death, while Crowe was temporarily absent from the house on an errand to the village, an errand that Dodd himself had suggested, as we subsequently established, by mentioning to Crowe that a message awaited him at the post office. The message, needless to say, did not exist. It was simply a device to clear the house for 40 minutes. Miss Ashwood's role was addressed with what tact the situation admitted. She had come to Blackthorn Manor under a false identity and had, technically, continued her mother's blackmail by sending the final demand letter. Holmes recommended, and Marvell cautiously concurred, that this matter be treated with discretion. The letter had, in practical terms, prompted Sir Reginald to put his affairs in order and acknowledge his daughter, and its continuation of the blackmail arrangement was sufficiently nuanced in its intent that prosecution would be both difficult and, given the circumstances, something less than just. Miss Torrance, Elspeth, sat through all of this with characteristic stillness, but her stillness was different now. When Miss Ashwood was identified as her half-sister, something happened in those amber eyes that was not the crack of the porcelain this time, but something more fundamental, a shifting of the foundations, an expression of profound, tentative shock. After Marvell had taken Dodd away and the others had dispersed in various states of agitation, she sat for a long while without moving, and it was Holmes, of all people, who spoke to her first. He sat beside her and said, in a tone of quiet directness, "You have a sister, and you are your father's acknowledged heir. The will, when read, will give you what was always owed to you. The people who kept these secrets are dead, or exposed, or known. The secrets themselves are no longer the weight they were." He paused. It is not comfortable to have the ground shift beneath one's feet, but the ground, in this case, has shifted toward truth. That is generally to be preferred. She looked at him for a moment, then she said, "My father was not, by your account, a good man. He was a complicated man who did some serious harm and spent 30 years attempting to mitigate it, and many more years avoiding full acknowledgement of it. In his last weeks, he chose acknowledgement. It cost him his life, which suggests, at minimum, that the choice was genuine." She considered this. "And you think that is sufficient?" "I think it is what it is," Holmes said, with the uncompromising realism that was, beneath his occasional theatrical flourishes, the deepest characteristic of his mind. "It does not answer every question. Very little does." Ashford, it transpired upon the reading of the will, was not as disadvantaged as he had feared. The estate in its entailed form came to him as expected. It was the unentailed properties and the substantial cash reserve, the fruit of Rosa Montero's 30 years of payments, carefully invested, that went to Elspeth, making her by some measure the wealthier of the two. He bore this with a grace that surprised me, until Holmes remarked, dryly, that Ashford's principal concern had never been the money itself, but the uncertainty about it, and that any definite outcome was preferable to a man of his temperament to prolonged suspense. Chapter 15. The Smoke of Baker Street. We returned to London on a Saturday, 4 days after our arrival at Blackthorn Manor, in weather rather less brutal than the outward journey, a low winter sun occasionally breaking through the clouds to lay pale gold bars across the bare countryside. Holmes sat in his corner, as before, watching the landscape with those pale eyes, but his expression now was the satisfied one, or the nearest to satisfaction he ever quite achieved, of a man whose work is complete and who has no immediate requirement to justify his existence. Dodd had confessed fully to Inspector Marvell, with, Holmes remarked, the comparative relief of a man who had spent decades maintaining a complicated lie and found the simplicity of acknowledgement, even at its worst, something of a relief. He had retained the counterpart agreement, not out of any intention to use it, but out of the same instinct for mutual deterrence that had governed the partnership for 30 years, the logic of mutually assured destruction, which collapses entirely when one of the parties decides to surrender. The agreement itself was damaging enough to keep several legal departments occupied for some months, involving as it did financial fraud, conspiracy, and the exploitation of certain parties who had trusted the partnership and been rewarded with ruin. Sir Reginald was dead and beyond prosecution. Dodd was 70 and infirm, but English law does not make exceptions for age, and Marvell was satisfied that the case against him was as complete as any he had handled. "You knew it was Dodd early," I said, as the train rolled through the Cotswolds. "Earlier than you let on." "From the second day," Holmes admitted. "The gun that had been cleaned, the key that Dodd possessed to every room in the house. The characteristic of the murder, patient, chemical, non-violent, designed to mimic natural death, which spoke of a man who had lived with this secret for decades and had long since worked out what he would do if it were threatened. That is not a crime of passion or opportunity. It is the crime of an old man who has been planning it in the back of his mind since the first day he understood that Sir Reginald's nerve might eventually fail. And the Ashwood connection, Miss Ashwood herself. She complicated matters considerably because her presence suggested a second party with motive. She had the knowledge of the secret, she had access to the study, she had chemical ignorance but sufficient intelligence to have found instructions. I ruled her out not on sentiment but on evidence. The traces of the compound in the lamp oil were consistent with a specific industrial preparation, not a domestic improvisation. Miss Ashwood could not have obtained the original material. Dodd, who had dealt in such substances 30 years ago and retained, as the very old often do, certain practical knowledge from his active years, could and did. And yet you brought her to Blackthorn Manor as your client. Holmes looked faintly amused. She was my client. Nothing in our initial interview suggested complicity in murder. She was, as far as I could determine at Baker Street, exactly what she presented herself as. A woman who believed a crime had been committed and wished to engage my services to prove it. That her own relationship to the case was more complex than she admitted. That was something that emerged only in investigation. She did not lie to me about the essential matter, Watson. She genuinely wanted the murder solved. Her other interests were additional complications, not disqualifying ones. I thought about this for a while, watching the countryside give way to the approaching sprawl of the city. And Miss Torrance? Miss Ashwood? What becomes of them? They are sisters who have only just discovered each other's existence, in circumstances calculated to make a normal introduction impossible. What becomes of them will depend upon their own natures and choices, which is precisely as it should be. He paused. Elspeth Torrance is a remarkable woman. She has grown up in isolation, without the knowledge of her own identity, without genuine connection to the family that surrounded her, and has managed in consequence to develop an extraordinarily independent character. Whether she and Miss Ashwood will find a relationship worth having is not something I can predict. The situation provides the opportunity. The rest is up to them. Outside the window, the first suburban stations were beginning to flash by. Holmes reached for his pipe, found it in his coat pocket, and contemplated it without lighting it. "You know," I said, "this case had more layers to it than any we have recently encountered." "All cases have layers," he said. "The question is merely how many one is willing to peel. Most investigators stop at the first satisfying surface, in this instance, cardiac failure in a locked room, and congratulate themselves on the tidiness of it. The surface was, in this case, particularly well crafted. Dodd understood that the simplest explanation, when it was also the emotionally satisfying one, the elderly, pressured man dying of shock, would survive more scrutiny than any elaborate visible crime. It very nearly did. It very nearly did, he agreed, which is why it is useful to have someone who finds the merely satisfying insufficient. Chapter 16. The World Turns On. Some 3 weeks later, on a cold December evening, I found Holmes in the Baker Street sitting room in a state of unusual contentment. He was not pacing, not performing chemical experiments at 3 in the morning, not in the black mood of boredom that so afflicted him between cases. He was sitting by the fire with a book open on his knee. and when I came in from an afternoon's calls, he greeted me with the absent warmth of a man in whom some private equilibrium has been restored. A letter lay open on the mantelpiece. I read it with his tacit permission. It was from Miss Elspeth Torrance. No, she had signed it, with a certain deliberately chosen formality. Miss Elspeth Blackthorn Torrance, written in a clear, educated hand that conveyed in its very composition the quality of measured deliberation that characterized its author. She thanked Holmes for his service in terms that were precise rather than effusive. She mentioned that the will had been formally read and that she had entered into possession of the unentailed properties. She mentioned, with a restraint that did not entirely conceal the significance of it, that Miss Ashwood, Cordelia, had accepted her invitation to remain at Blackthorn Manor as a guest for the present, and that they were finding, slowly and cautiously, and with considerable awkwardness on both sides, the beginnings of a connection. She concluded, "You remarked to me that the ground had shifted toward truth. I have been considering that remark. I think perhaps truth is less like a destination one arrives at, and more like a direction one maintains. For the moment, I am trying to face it squarely. That is the most I can claim." Holmes had underlined that last sentence in pencil, which for him was the equivalent of a standing ovation. "She is an exceptional woman," I said, setting the letter down. "She is a woman who has been, through no fault of her own, denied the materials from which an identity is usually constructed, family, history, knowledge of origin, and has built herself entirely from the inside, which produces, when it succeeds, a peculiarly solid foundation." He looked at the fire. "Ashford, I understand from Marvell's subsequent communication, has accepted the situation with more grace than I initially credited him. He has the house, the park, the entailed farmlands. He will live within his means, which he has never previously managed, and it will be good for him. And Dodd, committed for trial. A strong case, barring unforeseen developments. He is old, and will perhaps not long outlive the verdict in either case. I find I can summon very little that resembles pity, and very little that resembles vindictiveness. He made a choice 30 years ago to participate in something harmful, and he made a choice 3 weeks ago to kill a man rather than face exposure. Both choices were coherent, in a narrow way, from his own perspective. They were simply wrong. The law exists precisely because the narrowness of private perspectives requires an external corrective. I settled into my chair and stretched my feet toward the warmth. Outside, Baker Street was doing what Baker Street always did on winter evenings. The gas lamps haloed in mist, the cabs rattling over the cobbles, the city maintaining its vast and indifferent bustle. London had not paused for the death of Sir Reginald Blackthorn, or the trial of James Dodd, or the discovery of a daughter's identity 30 years delayed. It went on, as it always did, as cities and lives and the slow machinery of consequence always do. "Holmes," I said, after a companionable silence, "you said something to Dodd in the gatehouse that I have been thinking about. You said that a man's life is not a matter of rights. What precisely did you mean?" Holmes considered the question with genuine attention, a quality I had come to value about him, that he did not dismiss philosophical inquiries as beneath him, however impractical they seemed. "I meant," he said slowly, "that Dodd framed his actions in the language of entitlement. Sir Reginald had no right to break their arrangement, no right to upset what Dodd had arranged for himself, no right to choose honesty at the expense of their mutual convenience. That is the language of property applied to a living person's choices, and it is always, when applied that way, morally bankrupt." He paused. "A man may reasonably resent another's breach of faith. He has no rightful claim on another man's silence, however useful that silence has been to him. And yet," I said, "Sir Reginald's silence for 30 years was itself a form of ongoing harm, to Rosa Montero, to Elspeth. Precisely so, which is why, when he finally chose to speak, The decision was correct, even though it cost him his life. It was a belated decision, decades too late, and made under the pressure of Miss Ashwood's ultimatum, rather than from the spontaneous motion of conscience. But it was nonetheless correct. He folded his hands. The only genuine tragedies in this case are that Sir Reginald did not make this decision 20 years earlier, and that a man like Dodd could construct a 30-year life of apparent loyalty and service that was, at its foundation, simply the careful maintenance of a criminal secret. Both of those things are depressing observations about human nature, and I decline to dwell on them. He picked up his violin, which had been resting against the bookcase, and drew the bow across it in a single, experimental note that filled the room with resonance. Then, without any further preamble, he began to play one of the softer Mendelssohn pieces, long and lyrical and somewhat melancholy, the kind of music he turned to when a case had moved him in ways he did not intend to discuss. I listened, and thought of Blackthorn Manor standing in its frost and mist, and of an amber-eyed young woman learning the shape of her own history, and of the extraordinary, labyrinthine manner in which the buried past insists, always, upon making itself known. Holmes's bow moved across the strings with the precision of a man who understands that some things can be expressed only in forms that do not require explanation, and the Baker Street evening drew around us both, comfortable and familiar, and the fire burned on. It was, I reflected, one of the more complete satisfactions of our partnership, that Holmes solved problems with the unyielding rigour of a pure logician and mourned their human cost with the sensibility of a man who, whatever his protestations, was rather more alive to feeling than he wished the world to know. He would not have thanked me for saying so, and so I did not say it. I simply listened to the music and was content. A week later, a new client arrived at Baker Street with an entirely different difficulty, and Holmes set down his violin with that particular brightness in his eyes that signalled a fresh appetite, and the case of Blackthorn Manor receded into that long, remarkable archive of investigations with which we had between us furnished what I venture to think remains one of the more unusual careers in the history of English detection. But that, as they say, is another story. FINIS